Well, this is my testimony, how I came to know Jesus Christ. As a child and growing up, I never really had the background to any of the church background or the Bible background or anything to do when it came to Christ. Pretty much God and growing up in my family He was there when you needed Him. If someone was sick, you would pray, especially my brother who had cancer. You know, it seems like when he got sick, we'd pray for him at that time. And that's pretty much the only time that I ever saw really my family ever really pray, unless it was extended family that were Catholic. But that's pretty much what I saw. He was there when you needed Him, and that was it. He couldn't be everywhere at once. You know, he could only work miracles. And so when I met my husband, at the time was my boyfriend, you know, he was a Christian, and it came to be where we constantly fought because his view of God was totally different than mine. And growing up not having that Christian background, you know, we would get into fights because he would challenge me on things when it came to what I believed versus what he believed. You know, I believed that sin was if you do something to go to jail, or if you kill somebody, you know, break a law of some sort. That to me was a sin. That's what I grew up with as a sin. I didn't grow up with sin being, you know, just talking bad about somebody, or a cuss word would be a sin. So it was definitely an eye-opener for me, and I was always kind of told to stay away from, you know, any religious type of guy, just because religious was brainwashed. And that's kind of how I grew up. You were brainwashed if you were in any type of religion. And it was very interesting on how his family, you know, coming into his family, having them invite me to church, and that made me feel very awkward to go to church, just because it wasn't something I was into. I dreaded going. You know, Sundays were my day to sleep in. I didn't really want to get up in the morning to go with them, but of course, I wasn't going to say no to them. I was always going to say yes. So I would go, and of course, I would be bored, and I'd kind of go into my own little world there, and I would sing along, and I didn't understand what the whole thing was about to go, how everybody could sit there and just, you know, be so happy to be there. But a lot of the times, too, I'd look around, and I could see people would call themselves a Christian, or they were saved, and I didn't ever believe them because of their actions in return. You know, there would be times where people would be yelling and screaming at each other, but then they could sit there and say they were saved, or they were just not acting the way I thought a saved person should be. I always thought if someone sits there and says they're saved, that means that they're perfect in life, that they never make a mistake. They are just never wrong on anything that they do. They're just perfect. And so to me, non-believer, looking at believers, I just always thought, you know, you're brainwashed, because here you can sit there and you can go to church and you can pray and you can do all this, but then as soon as you get out of church, you're in there partying, you're doing this, you're doing that, and it's everything what I would think a saved person wouldn't be doing. And so when it came time about a year and a half ago, I went to church with, you know, the usual. We would go on Mother's Day, and I went for the first time and sat there and heard a sermon about relationship versus religion. And that was always my hang up on everything was, you know, how can Catholics and Christians not agree on something? If they are all worshiping the same person, how can, you know, Catholics talk about Christians? And how can that, you know, rivalry become such a heightened thing if, you know, everybody's worshiping God? And so that was a big thing for me. And so I really listened on things. And it was my first sermon that I ever sat through and actually tuned into it the whole time. And at the time, I didn't really realize that I was tuning into it. It was kind of like just a natural thing that I did. And then later on, I found out that my father-in-law had said that, you know, he thought that it had moved me, which I didn't really know that at the time. But then about a week or so later, I kind of started having little questions in my head kind of pop up into play and try to kind of ignore him, but not really ignore him, because at the time I didn't know what was going on, because, I didn't have a Christian background, and the Bible background I didn't have, so I didn't know why all of a sudden I was having all these questions, because before I could care less. And so I kind of started asking my husband, because he was, a Christian at the time, and he seemed pretty knowledgeable, and I know his dad's very knowledgeable, and his family is very knowledgeable about things, so whatever questions he couldn't answer for me, he would call his dad. And at the time, we really didn't say very much on his parents, so he would just ask questions, hey, I'm, just interested in this topic or whatever. And then I read a book called Heaven is for Real, and I've had it for probably 5 or 6 years, never read it. I always wanted to read it, but then I never really read it. And I started getting some information off of that, and then I'd go back and I'd talk to my husband about it. And I think he was kind of shocked too at the fact that I was even asking him questions, because most of the time when any of the topic religion or Christianity came up or anything, when it came to that, we would get into a huge fight over it, and it didn't settle well with me. So I think he was pretty shocked in the whole thing. And so we would sit down and kind of just talk for hours and hours and hours about it. And there was one time where I had told him that I want to talk about something, but I don't want to end up in a fight over it, because every time I would start a conversation, or we would start a conversation about it, it would always end up in a fight. And we probably talked for about a good 3 hours or so the first time about it, and didn't have a fight. There was no argument. There was no nothing about it. It was pretty much I would just sit and listen, and if I got confused or anything, I would, talk to him about it. And it probably went on for a good week or 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden I just broke down crying, and I was just like, all this guilt came over me, and when I was sitting there and I was, crying and feeling all the guilt, and I knew that it wasn't just me that was doing it to myself. I knew that there had to be something more. And, hearing everybody talk about how Jesus Christ came to earth to die for all your sins, hearing all that, it came clear to me on that, and believing that now. And that's what I was feeling. I mean, it just all came so clear that, this is what everybody's talking about. He came to wipe all your sins away, and that he already did that for you. And just all of it was just so clear, and it was just kind of lifted up from me on that. And I was so embarrassed of myself. I was like just humiliated. He would tell me, we should go talk to my family about this. They've been praying for you for a really long time to be saved. And I'm just like, I can't, because even though I didn't want to go to church, I still didn't want them to know that I wasn't, into it like they were. But of course, later on I found out that they really knew that I wasn't all that into it. But I still, just that embarrassment. I couldn't face them or, anything that had to do with it, because I just felt so embarrassed. Like, how could I have so much hate, and how could I talk so badly about someone that gave his life up for us? And I always did. I always talked horribly about him. And in our fights that we would have, it would just be, the things that I would say, I just had so much guilt and so much pain for that, and I just kind of wanted to wash it all away. And for probably about another 2 to 3 weeks, I couldn't really talk about it without, getting really emotional, and I wanted to go to his parents and talk about it with them, but I don't think I could even talk to him about it without crying. And so I just had to get all that crying, and I didn't know when it would stop, because that crying and that guilt and all, I hated myself for what I did, and I didn't know when that would stop. And finally it did, and we went over to his parents' house, and it was the first time that I actually was able to give my testimony. They were the first people to hear it, just because I knew that in my journey with Christ, I know that they're gonna be my rock too, because they have so much knowledge, and my family doesn't have any background with Christianity. They have a little background, and it has to do with Catholic, but this is completely different with Christianity. So I definitely wanted to talk to them about it, and just have it be to where I could go to them, and I know that they're going to be a huge part of it, just like my husband's going to be a huge part of it. But the one thing that I didn't realize was becoming a member of a church, or starting to go to a church, and how much joy you can have going to church, and how every sermon, you just can't wait to hear the next sermon. And I always kind of made fun of people that would always say, oh, that sermon spoke to me, or that song spoke to me. And now I'm one of those people that can sit there and go to church and say, wow, that sermon spoke to me, or that song spoke to me. And it's just an amazing feeling. And here, I'm one of those people that now, who I used to make fun of. But now I can see how much love, especially this church, has for everybody, and how close they are. And it's a huge enjoyment to be. And being a person that never went to church, and this is the first church that I went to. And, my husband, Jared, he came to this church when he was first saved by himself, and absolutely, loved Pastor Brian on just his way of speaking to you, about the gospel. And so we came, and it was just an amazing feeling. And you can tell that he speaks with his heart through the gospel. You can tell that Christ is really with him when he's speaking, and just with everybody in this church. I mean, you have people that are not afraid to come up and say hi to you, and if they don't recognize us, then they're willing to introduce themselves. And I'm a very shy person, so I'm not that outgoing on that, but it's just amazing. And I'm really seeing what a church is all about. I mean, it's a family. And I've heard people talk about how the church is the family of Christ. And I never really understood that until I started coming here and just seeing and feeling the love that this church has for Christ and for everybody in it. So I definitely wouldn't ever say to people, don't ever sit there and say that you'll never be a Christian, because I was one of those people. I would shout at the top of my lungs saying, I will never, ever, ever have anything to do with Christ, and I will never be a Christian, and just very hurtful things. And, my husband, he never told me, out loud. He would always kind of say it, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what you're going to feel. You don't know what you're going to become, because it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with Christ and what Christ is going to do. And, I realize that now, being a Christian versus not being a Christian. And I always thought that it was pretty much a choice that you made. If you did good, if, you went to church, or if you didn't go to church, but if you didn't kill someone, or you weren't a bad person, then you just go straight to heaven. And all that's gone now. Just because you think you're a good person doesn't mean that you're going to be going to heaven. And it has everything to do with Christ and having him come to you, or you come to him, and just be born again. And it's an amazing feeling. I mean, you have so much joy. And after I was saved, I had so much peace. My brother passed away, and I have peace with that now. There's a lot of things that were holding me up, and I've forgiven some of my family members that I never thought that I would ever do. And I mean, it's a journey, and you're gonna slip. Just because you're saved doesn't mean you're perfect. We're all human, we're all gonna sin, But it's the fact of you need those people there, just like in the church, to tell you when you're slipping up. And this is, a church that will, and that's, something that it's really nice to have. So I would just say, don't ever think that what's going to happen, because in reality, you don't have the power over what's going to happen to you. So, coming from a non-believer to saying that she would never, ever, ever become a Christian, and a year and a half ago, I became one.